American administrative law is the last of the major sources of law and the most recent to develop. Administrative agencies historically have been created in response to sudden crisis or serious social problems. During its early years, the United States was a predominantly rural society with a relatively simple, non-industrial economy. As the economy developed and society became more complex, demands for regulation arose. Near the turn of the 19th century, concern over perceived abuses of powerful corporations and anti-competitive monopolies gave rise to such agencies as the Interstate Commerce Commission. This was the very first governmental organization created in the United States that could be accurately described as a regulatory agency. Number 3, all administrative agencies, and I'm just talking about federal administrative agencies here, I'm not talking about state. Each state has its own administrative agencies. We're just talking federal. There's a lot of similarity in each one of the states. All federal administrative agencies are created by Congress. That's the legislative branch of government, isn't it? Notice, all administrative agencies of the federal government are created by Congress. Once created, most become, as far as carrying out the duties of the agency, a part of the executive branch. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? The legislative branch of government is to make laws. What does it take? What does it take to make, create an administrative agency? You have to make a law. And then the executive branch is the one who carries out, executes the law made by Congress. And it makes sense that now we have these new administrative agency, then it's the executive branch that is supposed to carry out the new law that the legislative branch made. And by the way, who's the boss of the executive branch of government?
The president.
The president. Now, a few agencies exist as independent regulatory agencies, and their officials cannot be removed without cause. But most are not this way, and the president can remove them with a snap of the finger. The administrative agency is given authority by Congress to make rules and regulations, to investigate violations, and here is the kicker, the one that's always caused the biggest problem: conduct judicial proceedings and impose penalties upon violation of rule makers. Historically in our country, what branch of government is supposed to conduct judicial proceedings?
The judicial branch.
The courts.
Yeah.
Okay? But now by the creation of administrative agencies, the administrative agency by Congress is given the authority to conduct judicial proceedings. They take it away from the
Department of
courts.
Justice, actually.
They took it away from the courts. Whatever the agency is supposed to regulate, they take away the court-making decision power away from the judicial branch of government and give it over to the agency. Not only does the agency make the rules, not only does the agency enforce the rules, but the agency now interprets the rules. Important. The rules and regulations made by administrative agency are not considered law in the general sense that that law comes from Constitution, courts, and legislative bodies. Even so, today the rules and regulations are enforced just like a law, so the result makes very little difference. In other words, it doesn't make any difference if your driver's license is suspended by the court or the DMV. The result is the same. Historically, disputes between people usually were settled by legal actions in the courts. The effects of the Industrial Revolution in America was causing great pressure on the courts to resolve complex business problems. The pressure was great enough to cause the executive branch of the legislative branch of government to step in and to do something about it. And what they did was to create administrative agencies. When did the American Revolution begin?
1780.
The late 1800s.
No, 1800.
The American Revolution?
18.
No. Okay, the Industrial Revolution in America.
1890.
It's getting late wait for me to. When did it begin? The late 1800s.
19 some.
You know, this is when big industry began, the railroads,
Yeah, 1880 some.
whatever. Those businesses created a lot of really complex business issues that the courts, who mainly were made up of judges from the farm, had no idea how to deal with them. And so guess what was happening? They were just backlogged. Like the ships out in our ocean are being backlogged because they can't bring them in to, unload them because of the bankruptcy of one of the big companies. Well, they just got backlogged. And of course, those businesses, they wanted those issues resolved. And so what they did, they went to the president, the executive branch, they went to the Congress, the legislative branch, and said, something's got to be done. The judicial branch isn't doing its job effectively. So the president, the Congress got together and did an end run. END-RUN. You know what that means? Anybody ever play football? Can you ever see football? The offense, of course, can either throw the ball or it can run the ball. If it chooses to run the ball, they can either run up through the line or they can go around the end. Okay? Well, what was happening here, in a metaphorically kind of way, is that the judicial decisions were just backing up. They were just hitting the line, and they weren't going anywhere. So the president of the Congress decided, okay, we got to figure out a way to get the ball around so we can advance these disputes. What they did was do an end run. They made administrative agencies, and they got away from the judicial branch of government. Today, as I've said this before, the judicial branch of government probably makes more rules and regulations that affect our individual lives than either one of the other three branches of government can. The Interstate Commerce Commission, number 6. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created in 1887, and it was the first regulatory agency created by Congress. The main purpose of the ICC was to regulate and control the railroad industry and particularly price-setting practices and to resolve disputes between competing companies.
Yeah, that was the age of the rubber barons and all that stuff. Vanderbilt.
That's right. Number 7, the next major piece of legislation to create an administrative agency was the Sherman Act of 1890. This was intended to regulate monopolistic practices in business and decide disputes. Number 8, during the first 60 years since the enactment of laws creating administrative agencies, most of the laws focused on economic issues within the American society. Now, during the last 40 or 50 years, the focus has shifted over to social issues, such as health, the environment, poverty, and discrimination. Number 9. More than 1/3 of all current regulatory agencies at the federal level were created between 1970 and 1979. The Roosevelt era. Big government. This includes the EPA, 1970, Occupational Safety and Health, in 1970, Consumer Product Safety Commission, 1972, and so on and so on. Remember, until the creation of administrative agency, disputes in the American society were decided by the courts. You can imagine how the courts began to react to the actions of administrative agencies, especially when the agency not only made the rules and regulations, but also decided in a judicial manner who broke the rules. As a result, during the first 50 years of administrative agency decisions that came before the court, there was a lot of conflict between the agencies and the courts. It was fairly common for the courts to strike down or reverse a decision of the administrative agency, mainly out of jealousy. And the court went ahead and made its own independent decision. You're not going to get away with that. We're going to do it ourselves. Finally, the sheer number of administrative agencies and the decisions that were being made by those agencies caught up with the courts. And in 1944, the case of Yackas versus the United States, the Supreme Court made a landmark decision which became a major turning point as it related to the actions of the administrative agencies making judicial decisions. Up to this case, up until this point, every time an administrative agency decision came before a court, the agency had the burden of proving that it was fair and reasonable. This was a really substantial burden, and many times it couldn't be met. In other words, the court would overturn it and make its own decision. In the case of Yackas, however, the court decided that the courts would no longer conduct their own independent trials to decide whether the action of the agency was fair and reasonable. The court decided from then on to accept the decision of the agency as fair and reasonable. In other words, it's assumed to be fair and reasonable at the very beginning. And the burden is proving that it was arbitrary and unreasonable. That now lies with the party challenging the decision. So, if the DMV takes away your driver's license and you appeal it to a court, guess what? 9 times out of 10 you're going to lose. Because it is assumed that the decision was fair and reasonable, and the court's not going to change it. That's because of the case of Yackas versus the United States in 1944. As a result, most administrative agency decisions are now upheld by the courts. Even so, one important thing the courts still insist on maintaining is that the authority to interpret the law that the administrative agency was created to enforce would be the courts. Since these agencies make their own rules, the court still retains the power to interpret the rule to make certain it was being applied fairly and in accordance with due process standards. Now, I appreciate it if you will read those chapters. There is, I think, attached to that outline, is it not, a review of constitutional law? Okay, be sure that you work on that. We'll start with that next week. I'll give you a little bit more information about constitutional law, a little bit more about administrative agencies, and then we'll do chapter 8. And guess what comes after chapter 8?
Another test.
Another test. So, you'll get used to taking it by the time we're done. Okay, thanks for your time.